People remember Tiede as being real nice and doing nice things, and they like my office to go real easy on them. And then there's a group that wants no mercy. Bernie Tiede was a well-known resident of Carthage, Texas. He was known for being generous and kind, especially to grieving widows of Carthage. Bernie Tiede was a mortician who worked as an assistant director at Hawthorne Woods Funeral Home. It is here in March 1990 where he met the newly widowed 81-year-old Marjorie Nugent. Marjorie Nugent was the richest widow in Carthage, and according to most locals, she acted as if she was too good for Carthage. She was known to be domineering and critical, lashing out at whoever disappointed her. People close to Marjorie Nugent would later admit she had to be constantly catered to and constantly flattered. When Mr. Nugent died unexpectedly of heart failure, only a handful of people came to his funeral to offer condolences. Bernie Tiede could see the loneliness etched in Mrs. Nugent's stern face as she stood by the casket. He sang a hymn in chapel and helped Mrs. Nugent to her car for the trip to the cemetery. You gotta admit, nobody could sing Amazing Grace like Bernie could. In the months after, Bernie was the only person to check in on Mrs. Nugent's well-being. The two eventually became inseparable companions, although she was more than 40 years his senior. In 1991, Marjorie altered her will and disinherited her only child, leaving her entire $10 million estate to Tiede. By 1993, Bernie left his job to work for Nugent full-time as her business manager and travel companion. It was a glamorous life, but Bernie had to pay a price for it. According to Bernie's friends, he had to have Mrs. Nugent's medicines laid out every day. If he wasn't at her house by 11:45 for lunch, she would become extremely frustrated, almost panicky. When visiting someone else, Bernie would have to interrupt the conversation at regular intervals and use the phone to check in with Mrs. Nugent. If I don't call her, she will give me living hell. Bernie became the town's Robin Hood. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Nugent, he started slipping money out of her healthy bank accounts and giving it to anyone he thought could use help. He bought at least 10 cars for people who couldn't afford one, telling them to pay him back when he could. He bought a home for a struggling young couple. He provided scholarships to students at the local college. He paid $100,000 to new building campaigns at First United Methodist Church, and he led fundraising drives for the local Boy Scouts. Bernie was a one-man campaign to improve culture in Carthage. Bernie's a sweet man. He's done a lot of good things for this town. He's given poor kids money to go to college and everything. In November 1996, Tiede killed Nugent in her garage by shooting her in the back. He shot her 4 times with a .22 caliber rifle. I don't care if Mrs. Nugent was the richest lady in the town. She was so mean that even if Bernie did kill her, you won't be able to find anyone in town that's going to convict him of murder. Bernie would go on to live the next 9 months as if nothing happened. Anyone who called Mrs. Nugent would get Bernie. Bernie would tell them that Mrs. Nugent was in Ohio visiting family. By late spring, he said she was in the nursing home outside Carthage, recuperating from a stroke, or that she was losing her mind and perhaps had Alzheimer's. After a lengthy absence, Mrs. Nugent's son showed up at her house looking for his mother. While searching the house, her son would tell the deputy how odd it was that the deep freezer had been taped shut. The deputy took a look inside at the bottom. Wrapped in a white sheet underneath some frozen food, was Mrs. Nugent. From the day that deep freezer was open, you haven't been able to find anyone in town saying, "Poor Mrs. Nugent." People here are saying, "Poor Bernie." Authorities would immediately spread through town looking for Bernie. They found him preparing to take a team of Little League baseball players and their parents to dinner. He seemed surprised that deputies wanted to talk to him. Officers took him down to the station for questioning. With officers looming over him in a small room at the sheriff's department, Bernie tried to keep his composure, but he grew increasingly nervous, and he finally calmly admitted to shooting Mrs. Nugent the previous November. He said he had used the same gun she made him shoot armadillos with. When asked why he killed her, Bernie looked at the officers in bewilderment as if the answer was obvious. At last, he said that Mrs. Nugent had become very hateful and very possessive. I started thinking about having to live with her for the rest of her life, and I just couldn't take it. I realized I couldn't stand it another day. A jury would later convict Bernie Tiede to first-degree murder and sentenced him to 30 years in prison.